It's tremendous to be back here. I was a very happy student at Exeter. I loved it, but my goodness me, this campus is really impressive. Coming back here and seeing what you've done with it is very uplifting. The Arab Spring, I mean, you're probably used to attending some really high-powered lectures. You've got people here like Gareth Stansfield and Dr. Omar Shaw, people who really, really know what they're talking about, and today you've just got me. So I'm going to give you, in answer to the questions, I'm going to give you my take on things, which is not based on profound research. It's based really on my perception, which you feel free to disagree with it, and I would really hope we're going to have lively Q&A afterwards. So don't be afraid to disagree with stuff that I'm saying. You may well be right, I may well be wrong, but this is based on my living there in several Arab countries and going to visit quite often. The Arab Spring is, in much of the Arab world, is almost a dirty word now, a dirty phrase. It's one which evokes a reaction, depending on where you are, of hopelessness, of despair, of contempt, of disgust, of dismissal. It very rarely gets a positive response. Why? Because it started out as this great hope that at last a part of the region that politically had dragged so far behind the rest of the world was at last going to get its chance at self-representation. All the things that you and I take for granted, freedom of expression, freedom of association, an accountable government, an independent judiciary, things like this, it's been denied for most people in the Arab world. Sadly, 3 years on, it's still denied. And some countries have gone backwards rather than forwards. So if you say to most Arabs, what do you think of the Arab Spring? They'll say, well, we call it the Shita al-Arabiya, the Arab winter, or the Arab autumn. Many don't even like the phrase Arab Spring. They never liked it in the first place. They call it the Arab Awakening, but then some say, well, that's actually a bit pejorative because you're implying that we were asleep. Politically, I would say, yes, they were, but not by choice, because governments kept them there. So, having lived in Egypt, in UAE, and Bahrain, and going to these countries, being lucky enough to visit all the Arab countries, I shared in the optimism, the naive optimism, 3 years ago, that all the media had, that this was going to be a new birth, a new beginning. And as I'm as disappointed as everybody that it hasn't worked out that way. But today we'll try and explore what has happened and why it's gone wrong and where these countries are in terms of any kind of progress. Rob.
Thank you. I was wondering whether the particular instances of failure, I suppose, that you hinted at, the primary example of that would, of course, be Egypt. Do you think that the Egyptian situation has made the whole prospect of Islamism as a political alternative less likely or more likely?
Just to explain the context of this, probably all know it, but just to explain, Egypt had military rule for decades. I mean, it's been ruled essentially by military people since 1952. But particularly under Mubarak, you know, it's had emergency rule ever since Sadat was assassinated in 1981. Mubarak was overthrown in just 3 weeks of protests in early 2011. And they then had elections the next year, and democratic, pretty largely free and fair democratic elections, which ushered in, by a narrow margin, the Muslim Brotherhood in the form of President Morsi. Unfortunately, he didn't rule very well, and he ruled so badly, so incompetently, that people got pretty fed up, and there were mass demonstrations, and then the military stepped in and effectively deposed him after just a year in office. So it was, America hesitated to call it a coup, but it cut short his, correct me, 5-year, I think, what should have been a 5-year rule to just 1 year. And he's now in prison, facing charges, and the Muslim Brotherhood has been banned as a terrorist organization. Well, Al-Qaeda and other extreme violent jihadist organizations, not exactly laughing, but they're scoffing, because they're saying, did you really think that the West was going to let you vote in and have an Islamist government? No. The only way to power is through the bullet, not the ballot box, because they will never allow it. And unfortunately, there are precedents to this, namely in Algeria and in the Gaza Strip, where in Algeria, in late 91, early 92, there were elections which were won by the Islamist party PiS, and those elections were annulled by le pouvoir, the military government, the military power, the sort of, well, the power. So they never got to rule. And then in Gaza, the Palestinian organization Hamas, the Islamist Hamas group, won the elections, but because they are considered as a terrorist organization by Israel, the United States, and others, therefore they haven't got full recognition. So that, to answer your question, it helps extremist, violent organizations in their argument that there's no point trying to bid for, we'll come to questions afterwards, there's no point trying to bid for political power democratically because you won't get it if it's a government that the West doesn't want or doesn't approve of. This is their theory, it is not mine, but this is their argument. So when Morsi lost power last summer in July, and the Muslim Brotherhood was declared a terrorist organization, which many people think is a big mistake, an overreaction, it's, I think, probably made the Middle East a more dangerous place.
Do you think that's had a knock-on effect in terms of the opposition movement in Syria, in terms of the way in which certain elements of the opposition movement has been able to mobilise, partly because of the failed experiments with Islamism in Egypt? Or do you think that we should treat these as separate events and the spillover, if you like, shouldn't be over-exaggerated?
My feeling is that Syria is a separate case, because Syria is a war. It is a civil war, but rather like Bosnia, there are pockets fighting pockets. You know, there's no front line as there was in Libya in 2011, where you had sectarianism was not an issue in Libya. You had the rebels, the opposition, advancing from the east towards Tripoli in the west. So there was an actual front line. If you remember those sort of people with machine guns, anti-aircraft guns mounted on the back of pickup trucks, they would go forward at Brega and back a bit at Sirte and forward and back, and then eventually they defeated Gaddafi's forces. In Syria, it's nothing like that. There are pockets that are controlled by the rebels, pockets that are controlled by the government, pockets that are controlled by secular rebels, and some by extremists who have no interest in the future for Syria. They just want to wage jihad. Syria is as I would say, a separate special case, but it's like a kind of black hole that has sucked in lots of extremist elements, and it is the theatre of jihad of choice for young men who want to go and fight jihad from all over the world, primarily from the Middle East, but at least 1,200, maybe more from Europe, quite a few from the United States. And of course the big concern is when the Syrian conflict eventually ends, what are these people going to do? Where are they going to go? What will they do with the so-called skills that they have learned? And there is a popular theory amongst jihadists who've gone to Syria that this is the West's fault, that it's in some way the West doesn't really want Assad to fall. Well, the West did want Assad to go for a very long time. The problem is that it's gone so badly wrong in Syria that it's not even clear now what the West wants in Syria. There has been stagnation in the UN, that the Security Council could never agree on what to do about Syria. Every motion to try and force President Assad and his government to leave was blocked by Russia and China. So there was never any agreement there. The West was, or the international community was extremely wary, for good reason, of intervening militarily. So it was left to rebels to try and look for weapons and support wherever they could find it. And it's come primarily from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And the most effective, powerful rebels have been the hardcore, hardline jihadists, who are not afraid to die, who are not afraid to do suicide bombings. And it's degenerated into an absolutely brutal civil war with atrocities being committed on both sides.
So, from a Global Uncertainties programme, which is sort of the auspices under which we're holding the event, we're trying to identify particular security threats and what might be considered as security threats that we should be particularly focusing our attention on, both in terms of research but also ultimately in terms of policy. Would you say that Syria represents a greater potential security threat than, say, the Egyptian situation, if we are to treat them as two separate focuses of analysis? Do you think that Syria is like the great problem, and depending on how it's solved, will dictate sort of security concerns for the next 5-10 years?
Unequivocally, yes. If you talk to anybody in government, in counter-terrorism on either side of the Atlantic, they will tell you that their big concern is Syria, because it's gone on for so long. Even if the Syrian conflict stopped tomorrow, the aftermath of instability and suffering there is going to go on for years. Syria is the tragedy of our modern times, and it's not easy to necessarily put the blame. It was right at the beginning. Just to be clear, Syria started out as an unarmed civilian protest by a population fed up with autocratic rule and no political freedom, and it morphed into what the government accused it of at the beginning unfairly. It morphed into an armed conflict. It wasn't armed at the beginning. It was just a brutalization of a population that was fed up. So it was a continuation of the Arab Spring. But because the border with Turkey, particularly the Syrian-Turkish border, which is hundreds of miles long, is porous, it's an incredibly easy theatre of jihad to go to. So literally, all somebody has to do is hop on a flight from Brussels, from London, from Paris, from Berlin to Istanbul, and walk across that border and hook up with groups so that they can then join ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to call it, one of the extremist groups, or Jabhat al-Nusra, and join one of the bands and fight jihad there. And unfortunately, the people who are going are not Syrians. They're not people who want to see a free, fair, and prosperous Syria. They are fighting what they see as a just religious cause against an apostate government. And their vision is wider than the Syrian borders. It's, the people who are fighting there, their political aim is to create a caliphate right across the region, stretching into Iraq. And sadly, the fighting is bringing untold misery to people across the whole region. So the concern is that with all these hundreds of people, thousands of people rather, going to fight there, that they will become so brutalized by what they've seen, the kidnappings, the beheadings, the torture, the amputations, on a daily basis, some of it being videoed and uploaded onto YouTube, or at least up onto social media, that their threshold of violence is so much lower than ordinary people's. So the kind of thing that would make you or I go, oh my God, I can't watch that. They're fine about it. Yallah, behead him. And that's the really scary thing that is worrying people, that these people will eventually come back to their countries of origin, be it Belgium, Bosnia, United States, Britain, Egypt, wherever, and will want to continue in the same way as what happened after Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, there's some academic research done by the Norwegian Defence Institute, called the FFI, which done by somebody called Dr. Thomas Heghammer. And they've worked out that historically, the ratio of people who come back from a theatre of jihad to then join a militant group in their own country of origin is 1 in 9, historically. Now, if you say that roughly 1,500 people are known to have gone from Europe to Syria, and the Syrian conflict shows no sign of ending, that would imply that a pretty substantial number of people are at risk of coming back and joining some kind of militant activity. And it's going to keep, people like MI5 and the FBI and Homeland Security extremely busy for a very long time. Those who go out there, they and their relatives say, you don't have to worry about us, we're not coming back. But people do eventually, and that's the fear.
Thank you very much. So that gets us started. I'd like to sort of open it up now for some questions. How do you want to do this round? Do you want to collect a few questions and then answer, or do you want to do it one by one?
But however you want to do it. I know the lady in the front had a burning question.
Okay, so if people raise their hands now, I get a sense then of how many questions I've got to organise this on. So if you raise your hand now, if you've got a question for Frank, I see some questions at the back. Okay. Who was the lady at the front who you want to... Oh, right, it was Lisa. Okay, we'll come to you in a minute, Lisa. Okay, we go to start at the back. Could you raise your hands again? I didn't see you. Yes, the gentleman there in the jacket. Yes, thank you.
Why do you believe that?
Could you just wait for the microphone, because it's coming up the steps.
This, by the way, is an Egyptian thing like, hang on. First time somebody did it to me, I thought, he's being really rude. But no, it's a piece of time, just wait.
Yeah.
Why do you believe that General Sisi has much support in Egypt despite the political repression that's still going on?
I don't believe I did say he had a lot of support in Egypt at all. What I said was that there were mass demonstrations in July 2012 against the previous rule of President Morsi. There is enormous criticism of the way Egypt has reverted to an autocratic government. The one thing I would say is that, as you probably know, the thing that people crave in the Middle East is security, is stability. We saw it in the worst years in Iraq, and there's a risk that Iraq is going back to those bad years of violence, where you saw women screaming to the camera saying, my God, even the worst years under Saddam Hussein were better than this, because at least it was safe enough for me to send my children to school. Security is something that matters more, debatably, even more than democracy for people, because you can't have democracy without security. And in Egypt now, the pendulum has swung very far the other way. I think many people would say that Egypt has got an even stricter government now than it was under Hosni Mubarak 3 years ago. It remains to be seen whether Sisi is going to be a popular president. I'm fairly certain he will stand for president. I'd be really interested to know what Dr. Omar, who is really the expert on Egypt here, what he has to say about it. Doctor, do you want to chip in here, Dr. Omar?
We have to get a mic to him if he's going
to... I think it's a very big country. You will have some support for General Sisi, and it's, the military has a significant segment of support in the society. But also you have a significant segment, until now, pro-President Morsi. 51 million voters, 26 million of them bother to vote. Tahrir Square takes 480,000 with all of its nearby streets. And the other, Rabaa Square, takes another 408,000. So basically, less than 500,000 can claim that they are Egypt and declare themselves as the legitimate rulers of the country.
Which I think sort of really illustrates a very important point here, is that one of the legacies of the Arab Spring, and that not at the moment a particularly healthy one, is that it has polarized a number of the populations in a number of countries. So where you remove, even temporarily, very strict autocratic rule, it suddenly reveals huge divisions in society. I mean, it happened in Yugoslavia after Marshal Tito died. It took a decade, but eventually that country disintegrated. It's happened in Bahrain, where the country is polarized between those who support the opposition and in many cases would like to see the monarchy gone altogether, and those who support the status quo. It's happened in Syria, where you either think the country's salvation lies in the relatively secular government, or the secular government of President Assad and the army, or it lies in getting rid of him. In Egypt, it's polarized the country more than I can ever think. I lived twice in Cairo, and I can't think of an Egypt that's ever been as polarized between, just as Dr. Omar says, those who support the Muslim Brotherhood and those who support the military power.
While we're on Egypt, have we got any more questions on Egypt? So this would be a good time to raise your hand if you've got specific Egyptian questions. I see a gentleman there just on the left-hand side, and I saw one over here specifically on Egypt. Okay, all right. Well, we'll start with a specific Egyptian question here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the election that took place in Egypt a couple of years ago, the one in which Morsi was elected as president. Because as I recall, there were two candidates in the sort of final part of the election, Morsi himself and a former minister in the Mubarak government, I think it was. But as far as I recall, no secular party candidate. They seem to be missing from the whole process, and I just wondered why that was. I wondered at the time, I'm wondering now. Is it they couldn't get themselves organised enough to actually agree on a candidate that would command support across that particular part of the political spectrum?
Well, that election, which was largely free and fair, was essentially a vote between going back to the old status quo and having a fresh start. And by a fairly narrow margin, the population, the electorate, voted for a fresh start. Unfortunately, it ended up being a disappointment, but that's what they voted for. And the big criticism, rightly or wrongly, is that they weren't given the full term in government to try. Now, the army would say they had to step in because the country was going down the tubes. That's their excuse for it. Unfortunately, the way it was put down was extremely bloody, and hundreds died, as you know, in the mosque square and in the mosque itself. So it was a tragedy what happened. In terms of organising secular parties, I think the candidate who stood against Morsi, probably you could call him secular. I don't think he was religious. But historically, this was an incredibly quick period of time, only a year after Mubarak fell, to organise elections. You know, in the big scheme of things, this is very fast. I mean, the whole thing has happened really quickly. And one of the things I would say about all of this is that the Arab Spring isn't over. This is a continuation of a process which really started when colonial powers withdrew, and unfortunately democracy did not come to the region, and it still hasn't come to the region, but people are going to keep on trying, and there will be spikes of democratic activity, and then perhaps things will subside, and then there will be further spikes, until eventually, hopefully, one day, the Middle East will be really fairly and well governed.
There was another Egypt question here. Is this an Egyptian question? Okay, right, okay. If we take this one, and then if you could run up the stairs and take the next one, we'll take the two together, and then maybe we can move on to some other topics. But yes, please.
What's your opinion on the Al Jazeera journalists currently under trial in Egypt, and do you think that's a kind of thing to do with media repression in the wider Middle East, or do you think that's something like just inherent to Egypt itself and how they're doing things?
Well, obviously, as a fellow journalist, I think they should be released. And you know, we've held BBC. People from BBC have gone down and joined sort of protest move. You know, little silent protests. It's political, because behind this, of course, is Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar played a very big role in the initial uprisings of the Arab Spring, particularly in Libya in 2011, but also in Egypt. And Egypt being now very polarised, the military powers, the military-backed government in Cairo, has outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation, in their words. Who backs the Muslim Brotherhood? Who's the main backer? Qatar, which is the state-controlled satellite TV broadcasting network of Qatar, Al Jazeera. So they consider that, you know, essentially they have branded these three journalists as subversives, and they're determined to hang tough and make an example of them. So I would hope that they get released.
Yes, please.
Thank you. To what extent do you believe that the Western reaction to the massacres which happened after the coup in Egypt and the violation of human rights there has supported the Al-Qaeda's logic and supported the double standard policy which is followed by the West in this regard? And to what extent do you believe that this issue should have been maybe taken into another maybe reaction? Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think that the West, and by that I mean Western governments, have really struggled to keep up with this is no, do this. We need some like really serious questions. I think Western governments have really struggled to try and keep abreast of what's going on with the changes in the Arab world. They didn't see it coming. We in the international media didn't see it coming. President Mubarak, with the most extensive, pervasive internal security organization, didn't see it coming. So they've struggled to keep up. I think if one lesson has been learned by the West, it's actually to butt out and try to keep out of things and let the region sort itself out. So I think the Western governments are very burnt by their experience in Iraq, where it's cost blood and treasure and credibility. And there is a feeling that actually Western intervention in the Middle East is not particularly useful, or in recent years. So I think that there is a reluctance to become too involved. Now, the Arab Gulf rulers were appalled at how quickly Washington dropped their old ally, Mubarak. And they thought, crikey, if they drop him that quick, what happens if we have an uprising here? Are they going to drop us as well? And that's made them quite paranoid and wondering whether they should be making new alliances with Moscow, with Beijing, with new friends. So it's upset a lot of the traditional alliances and strategic partnerships in the Middle East. I don't know if your question is saying specifically, are you saying that the West should have essentially boycotted the new government in Cairo? Is that what you're saying?
I think that maybe the position which is taken should have been maybe stronger than this position, because the Arabs now have seen what is happening in Ukraine and the Western reaction to what happened there. Why is this double standard keeping happening in the Arab world? In Algeria, in Egypt, in Gaza Strip, we think that there is a common line between all these events, and the reaction which is now from the West is not understandable enough in the Arab world in a positive way.
You may be right. I mean, the major difference is that Ukraine is in Europe, just, and it's a partnership for peace country. It's not in NATO, but it is right on the borders of NATO. And therefore, the EU and the US are going to be very, very concerned and interested in what's happening in Ukraine. More so, I think, probably than what's happening beyond the borders of Europe. I know it's a popular theory that it's in some way a deliberate policy to let Assad do what he's doing in Syria. They tried diplomatically. They tried to resolve this through the UN. They've tried to do it in Geneva with peace talks, and it hasn't worked. There is an enormous reluctance to intervene militarily. As you know, after the August chemical strike, there was very nearly missile strikes. Those didn't go ahead because, you saw why. Parliament didn't support it. Congress didn't support it. There was no appetite in our elected assemblies for further Western military action in those countries.
What do you think about what do you think the linkage is between the West's reaction to the Ukraine issue and the West's reaction to the Syria issue? Do you think that international relations works in this way, that an experience in Syria, such that it was in terms of the relationship with the Russians, has affected the response to the Ukraine crisis?
No, I think they're separate. I mean, I think that after Iraq, there is a renewed determination to try to at least push for resolving disputes through the UN Security Council, to do it through the rule of law and by international consensus. And there was international consensus in the UN over what to do about Libya in 2011. If you remember, Gaddafi and his family threatened to wipe out the rebels in Benghazi. Like rats, I think they referred to them, or cockroaches, and they looked poised to conduct a massacre. So at the 11th hour, France and Britain were able to galvanise the UN Security Council into authorising airstrikes and a no-fly zone, which included airstrikes on Libyan government positions in 2011, and that tipped the balance. So that essentially allowed for the overthrow of Gaddafi's regime. Libya hasn't ended up in a success story since then, but the West has largely withdrawn from that. In Ukraine, likewise, there is, I think, zero appetite for any kind of Western military intervention there. They will go as far as bolstering the borders of NATO's eastern flank, so sending Typhoons and F-16s and F-15s to countries like Poland and Baltic states, and limited sanctions. But there's no appetite for conflict there at all. And I mean, I've been recently covering the Sochi Winter Paralympics, and it's been fascinating watching President Putin stand up in the Fish Stadium in Sochi amongst tens of thousands of Russians who are cheering him to the rafters because he has restored their national pride. And to so many Russians, I mean, we're digressing a bit here, but the return of Crimea to Russian territory is a no-brainer to them. This was always Russian. It should never have been given to Ukraine, they think, in 1954. It's come home. It's what the majority of the population want. Why on earth would why is the West complaining about this? To them, they don't understand it. But in terms of international law, what's happened in Crimea is a violation of 3 pieces of international law that Russia signed up to in the 1990s. And that's why the EU and the US, and actually the rest of the world, Japan included, are making a stand over it. It doesn't entirely answer your question, and it's a bit of a digression.
Okay. Please, yes, there's a lady here, please, with the cover.
Yeah, thank you. I think we began talking about Egypt and Syria, maybe missing that the Arab Spring, or what we can call it, begins also in Tunisia. So how do you read what happened to Tunisia, and do you consider it a success or not?
I certainly don't consider what's happened in Egypt a success at all, no.
No, in Tunisia, sorry.
Tunisia, sorry,
yeah.
I misheard you. Life in Tunisia under President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, who is now in exile in Saudi Arabia, and has been tried and found guilty in censure by his own country, life wasn't at all free, fair, democratic. It was pretty autocratic, but it was safe. What's happened since then is that you've got a society which is now much less safe, more dangerous, but it's got the initial stirrings of democracy. You've got a fairly lively political life there, but again it's become polarised between those who support the Nahda, the Islamist party, which is fairly moderate, and secular parties. But unfortunately, there is something of a security vacuum there, which has made life in Tunisia a lot harder for a lot of people. And it's not a terribly attractive place economically at the moment. It may yet become a success story. But certainly Tunisia has not suffered anything like as badly as Egypt, Yemen, and Syria have suffered. So I think, remember that Tunisia is where it all started. That was the spark in December 2010 with Mohamed Bouaziz, the grocery seller who was told to move along, that he couldn't sell his groceries on the street. Officials told him it was just too much. So he set fire to himself, and that was the spark that lit the so-called Arab Spring. It may well be the first of the Arab Spring countries to emerge out the other side, but it isn't out the other side of the tunnel yet.
After I've had his hand up earlier, so if you could down here. Got some other questions just so that I can clock you on my radar. Okay, I see. Yeah, okay. I see some more over there.
Thank you. You mentioned something about butting out. I'm just wondering, what should Britain be doing in the Middle East? What, in terms of militarily or otherwise?
It depends which part of the Middle East. What should Britain be doing in the Middle East? I mean, my personal opinion is involve itself as little as possible. the time for military interventions, I think is, my personal belief, is over. But where you've got sovereign Arab states who are asking for training, for support, and are happy to host bases, that's different from intervening with an invasion. So I think, most people would consider that the 2003 invasion of Iraq was probably a bad thing. I say that with British understatement. Though that said, if they had followed that up without making such crass mistakes in the occupation and the months following it, such as disbanding the Iraqi army, banning Ba'ath Party members from any jobs, failing to seal the borders, essentially, dismembering the entire backbone of a strong government. Those were terrible mistakes that need not have been made. So the invasion and occupation went far worse than it should have done. But it's given Western military intervention in the Middle East a pretty bad name. Libya, to some extent, reversed that, because it was a very limited intervention. There were really no boots on the ground. There was probably some special forces, but essentially it was an air campaign and an offshore campaign with helicopters and naval support, backing a largely cohesive rebel force that overthrew a truly horrible regime. I went to Libya many times, and it was just a horrible place under Gaddafi. Unfortunately, it's not a happy place now. It's got, 300 militias refusing to put down their weapons, no proper rule of law, no security, porous borders, leaking armories with weapons that are spreading out across the Sahel into the Sahara. So it's very far from a success story. I think that it's where you've got countries like, say, the UAE that are happy to host bases, or rather to open up their bases to Western forces. I don't see any great objection to that. If it's being done without any kind of coercion from the West, it's done at their invitation. Training, exchange of officers. One of the things that is quite controversial here is that Britain has a defence academy, and they host lots of courses there, they run courses, and you see all sorts of people from countries that you would be quite surprised to see there. And I've said to people in the military, I'm surprised you're training people from such and such a country, which hasn't got a particularly good human rights record. And the reply is always, yes, I know, it's a little bit tricky, but we would rather that they learnt about law of armed conflict, and that we can at least try to conduct things according to the Geneva Convention rather than isolating them. That's the justification for it.
Okay, I have some questions down here. Yeah, yes, lady in the grey cardigan, yes, please.
Hello. My question is around our understanding or our conceptualization of what security means. I think the Arab Spring has evidenced that there is a different understanding between what security means for the state and what security means for the people. Before the Arab Spring, states were very secure. Now you say that the Arab region is insecure. But what if we understand security in terms of human security and freedom of expression, and the way in which people are trying to express themselves freely and trying to get rid of this authoritarian rulers that are trying to just secure the state?
Thank you. I understand your question, and I would agree with you that one of the unpleasant facets of rule in much of the Arab world, which is one of the things that sparked the Arab Spring in the first place, is that so many countries have been ruled by unelected autocratic rulers who will deploy the full machinery of state to keep themselves in power. And one of the things that fueled the Arab Spring is the well-founded suspicion amongst populations that Republican rulers were going to simply hand over power to their sons in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen, and so on. And the Arab Spring has certainly put a stop to that. Iraq, likewise, but obviously that was already over in 2003. These dynastic republics was something that really upset people, even more than it's upset populations in the monarchies. But coming back to your question about security, well, I would agree with you that it's still a pretty unhappy situation if you've got security, but you've got no freedom of expression. But take Iraq, for example, where since the invasion, kidnap for ransom, which was almost unheard of in most of Iraq under Saddam, became very commonplace, and that it wasn't safe for an average merchant, a cloth merchant, for example, on an average wage, to even send their children to school unescorted, and that people were getting kidnapped and ears sent through the post and ransom and that kind of thing, with ransom demands. It's really awful. That kind of thing did not take place under Saddam's rule. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting that life under Saddam was perfect. It was horrible. And there was a state brutality. There was no freedom of expression. Look, I was in Basra in 2003, immediately after the invasion, before my injuries, and I remember a Basrawi, someone from Basra, he led me by the hand around the cells of the Mukhabarat, the intelligence torturers, basically, in their headquarters in Basra. And he told me the things that they did to him and his friends, who were not even revolutionaries. Perhaps an unguarded word, perhaps a veiled criticism of the president had landed them in there. And I came out of those cells thinking, in May 2003, this invasion is probably a good thing, because it's done away with this horrible, cruel, barbaric, despotic regime. But the chaos that has followed has led most people to conclude that the invasion was probably not a good thing, because it led to so much misery, so many deaths. So it's a blurred area.
Thank you. Questions on the... Where's the mic? Oh, here we are. Yeah, the gentleman in the grey jumper, please.
Thank you. It's a question related to security again. Given the fact that many more women die from domestic violence and abuse in the United Kingdom than British soldiers have died in Helmand Province, and given the fact that many more British people die on roads than have died in the Iraqi or the Afghanistan campaign, do you think that the misogynistic and petrolhead Jeremy Clarkson is a greater threat to British security than Al-Qaeda? Or more seriously, what is the threat from the Middle East to the United Kingdom?
I don't think the Middle East is a threat to the United Kingdom at all. There is a threat from European-based jihadists who've gone out to Syria and may want to come back and commit, possibly some of them, a minority of them may want to commit some kind of act of violence here. I would hope that doesn't happen. I would hope that these fears that government says about this happening are unfounded, but historically they probably are founded. But other than that, I don't think the Middle East is a threat to... In fact, I've never gone along with this idea of the clash of civilizations. I have been lucky enough, both while I was at this university, because I used to take little cheeky bucket shop tickets during the Easter holidays from my Exeter course in Arabic. I would go down to somewhere like Tunisia and Algeria and just wander around the Sahara for a couple of weeks, practicing my Arabic. And I got nothing but hospitality and friendship and kindness. And with the glaring example of what happened to us 10 years ago, I've had a fantastic time in the Middle East. So there's no reason why we should see the Middle East as a threat. Quite the opposite. It was a cradle of civilization. It's where so many wonderful things came from, like algebra and alchemy and astronomy and poetry and arts and literature. So these things often get overlooked or smothered by modern day politics. But 1,000 years ago plus, people were doing things in the Middle East. They were inventing and drawing and creating things while we were still thrashing around in marshes and hitting each other with sticks, practically.
Yes, please.
Frank, where's the hope in the Middle East? Which states give you some hope going forward?
which states in the Middle East give me hope? Well, a large part of the Middle East has not suffered the worst effects of the Arab Spring, but they have had their warning, they've been put on notice, and I think that's a good thing, that's encouraging. So, which are the countries that have been affected? Tunisia's lost its ruler, Egypt's lost its ruler, Libya has lost its ruler, and Yemen. Bahrain wobbled, but has stayed. Syria is in the middle of a civil war. But other countries have looked over their shoulders and thought, crikey, this looks pretty serious. I'm talking about during 2011 and 2012, and maybe we need to actually reform a bit and give people a bit more democracy, a bit more of a say. So, namely, Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, these countries have reacted by opening up just a little bit, and that's got to be a good thing. Saudi Arabia reacted by banning demonstrations, or is getting a fatwa issued saying that protests were un-Islamic, but they also announced $127 billion of subsidies, which went mainly into the religious and armed forces institutions, which was quite a clever way of sort of heading off any unrest of the past. And at the risk of sounding like I'm plugging my own book, which is exactly what I'm doing, in May, my book, Blood and Sand, is going to be republished with an updated chapter on Saudi Arabia, because I went back last year, for the first time since being shot there, I went back to partly to sort of lay the ghosts of what happened, but also to explore for a BBC documentary, which some of you may have seen earlier last year, on how has Saudi Arabia escaped the Arab Spring? How is it that, debatably, the least democratic country in the Middle East has managed to avoid the Arab Spring? And it's not just about money. There are other reasons too. So, I forget what your question was. What was it? Is there any hope? Yes. I mean, I would hope that countries in the region look at the writing on the wall and realise that they must reform if they're going to survive. Now, there is a strong body of opinion inside government circles in certain Gulf Arab countries which says that we've beaten the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is dead and buried, Halas finished. We don't have to worry about it anymore. We can carry on as normal. But the more enlightened princes and sheikhs realise, and one of them actually said this to me, that he said, in 20 years' time, I think the way we rule, or the way these countries are ruled, will be very different from how it is now. So I think they've got to reform to survive, and the smarter people in those ruling families, and in possibly republics like Algeria, realise that.